The unlikely success of Resident Evil, a history of Resident Evil 1. I've been playing Resident Evil 1 on stream at night. I'm probably about a quarter way through it. I'm about to get out of the mansion, I think. So I think this is a good time for me to watch a Resident Evil video about what it was like when Resident Evil 1 first released back in the 90s.
Why did Resident Evil work? It's not an unfair question. While many agree that it was Resident Evil 2 that turned the franchise into the powerhouse that it is today, it required the success of the first game in order to happen. A game that has been released several different times and remastered twice.
Hopefully a third time. Hopefully it gets remade.
By all
That'd be
accounts, the first Resident Evil had terrible voice acting, a dodgy story, and one of my top 5 worst control schemes of all time, tank controls. And with all that going against it,
I love how shitty tank controls are, though. Dino Crisis, original Resident Evil games. Even Resident Evil 4 has tank controls. People don't ever think about that, but it does. It's just in third person.
The game turned out to be a hit. Why? Well, today on Arcadeology, we're going to dive into the creation and subsequent success of Resident Evil. The horror genre was underutilized in the early days of the game industry. Before the crash of 1983, there were only a few games that could be reasonably considered horror, like 3D Monster Maze. In the decade that followed, most of which was during a boom in the slasher genre, there were more efforts to design horror games. And some of these games were both successful and memorable to this day. These include Splatterhouse, Alone in the Dark, System Shock, and more. But there wasn't
Love those games, especially System Shock.
a moment in which the industry collectively decided to push toward developing horror, at least not yet. In the late 1970s, Space Invaders prompted many companies to ride the defending the Earth against alien invasion wave, and Pac-Man created a fascination with maze chases. Super Mario Bros. Pushed everyone in the direction of side-scrolling platformers. Horror's gaming moment arrived in the form of Resident Evil. Called Biohazard in Japan and released in 1996, Resident Evil sparked a golden age of horror and game development that lasted through the early 2000s. The game's origin, though, dates 7 years prior with another game titled Sweet Home.
I like Sweet Home, only because I knew that it was the original Resident Evil. I don't remember where I heard that. Was it Angry Video Game Nerd? I think that's where I heard it.
Now, Sweet Home was something that was out of place when it was released in a good way. The game is a top-down 8-bit RPG that graphically would look familiar to fans of old-school Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games. Unlike those games, though, it was a horror title based on a Kiyoshi Kurosawa film of the same name. Capcom and game designer Tokuro Fujiwara.
Good show, by the way. Also, I think it's on Netflix. Good show.
Were brought on by the studio to make a game adaptation that would have a day-and-date release with the film. Prior to this, Fujiwara had worked mostly on arcade classics like Ghosts and Goblins, Commando, and possibly my favorite platformer of all time, Bionic Commando. The game, loosely based off the film, takes place in a mansion where a documentary crew has been trapped by a spirit while attempting to preserve the frescoes of a dead artist. Some of the choices Fujiwara made for the game were a bit experimental. Unshackled from the need to follow the plot of the film exactly, as well as not needing to consider an arcade version of the game, Fujiwara developed the game mechanics that were rather ahead of their time.
Should I do a Sweet Home playthrough? I'm doing Resident Evil series. I might as well do Sweet Home. Maybe around the time I do Code Veronica. Because I will be doing Code Veronica X.
These included being
the PS2 version, because that's the one that I have.
Able to split the party up, dropping and picking up items, and also permadeath. Also, check out this door transition. Look familiar? Fujiwara's success with Sweet Home would land him with a promotion up to producer, which, from what I can gather, meant that his days with direct hands-on development of games were over. Fujiwara, though, would carry the experience of developing Sweet Home and horror with him. A few years later, on the verge of a new generation of consoles, a Capcom executive sent out a memo recommending that the company begin investigating the development of a horror game using 3D technology.
This guy kind of reminds me of Brandon Herrera, if Brandon Herrera liked office jobs instead of guns.
Fujiwara, who'd been wanting to get back into horror since his experience with Sweet Home, decided to assign the project to his protege, Shinji Mikami. Mikami, up until that point, had been working exclusively on
Aladdin, good game. Hard game, good game.
Capcom's Disney
I played it on the Sega Genesis, I think. I didn't play the Nintendo version.
license. His bestseller being the SNES version of Aladdin, which
No, it was other way around. I played the Nintendo version, not the Genesis version.
to be honest, is a pretty tight game. According to Fujiwara, Mikami at the time was terrified of the horror genre, which meant that he was perfect for the role. Mikami was unsure about the game. He didn't know if a mainstream horror game would sell, and all evidence up until that point made it seem like a dicey proposition. Whether the game was ever intended to be a remake of Sweet Home or not is anecdotal information at best. What we do know, though, was that Sweet Home and another horror game, Alone in the Dark, served as inspiration points for several of the design choices that were made. So what were those influences? For Sweet Home, first and foremost, would be the conceit of the story. A group of people are somehow trapped in a spooky mansion.
I played the Alone in the Dark remake that was on, like, I think it was Xbox 360. Not good. Not a good game.
Only instead of a documentary crew, they were police officers. Additionally, concepts like strict inventory management originated in Sweet Home and found their way into Resident Evil. Additionally, Sweet Home placed an emphasis on puzzle solving, something that was quite prevalent in the gameplay of Resident Evil. In fact, it is probably this element that is most inspired by Sweet Home. And, as I mentioned before, the door transitions. What parts were inspired by Alone in the Dark? Well, the camera angles, which are honestly a bigger part of the design of the game than anything taken from Sweet Home. When Resident Evil was in early stages, the idea was to develop it from the first-person point of view and build the game entirely out of polygons. Technical limitations, though, prevented that idea from coming to fruition. After playing Alone in the Dark, Mikami and team understood the effectiveness of using a fixed camera angle with pre-rendered backgrounds. While he was certain immersion and therefore horror would be lessened by the switch, they did it anyway for the sake of creating higher resolution and more detailed environments. This is a complete side note, however, but Resident Evil 7 was widely considered a return to form for the franchise, while ditching the third-person camera angle in favor of the first-person camera angle that the series was intended to have at the very beginning. Another fun nod to the early days of Resident Evil is the documentary crew, which could be seen as a reference to Sweet Home. But I digress. Character and story shifted throughout development as well. Zombies were decided on as the ubiquitous enemy by either Fujiwara or Mikami. Literally both have claimed to be the progenitor of that idea in different sources. Eventually, after a prolonged development process, well, prolonged for the time period, Resident Evil would be released in 1996. Reviews for Resident Evil were great.
I was one. I was still shitting yellow.
Many reviewers echoing that the game was one that could be a game changer for the industry, but even reviewers with the most effusive praise still could not overlook the voice acting. In 1996, voice work was uncommon in video games, but even for then it was just downright awful. The dialogue itself was poorly written.
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
And it was a combination of poorly written and poorly spoken that made Resident Evil's voice acting the height of hilarity.
Hope this is not Chris's blood.
Historically, it was the voice talent that has been blamed for this, but is that fair? Well, according to DC Douglas, the current voice of Albert Wesker, no, it's not. On a voice acting panel in 2014, Douglas, unprompted, defended the work of Sergio Jones, the original Albert Wesker, stating that in the early days of game voiceover work, actors were often brought into a booth with all their lines printed on a spreadsheet with no context given as to when these lines were actually being spoken. The director would then have the actors read each line with a different emphasis on each word, and then the files would be sent to an audio engineer in Japan who would pick and choose dialogue based on what sounded best to his ear, not what sounded best to the ear of an English speaker. Special thanks to Josh Wartinen from RetroEvolve.com for this information.
That actually explains a lot. Because, like, there's no way somebody who actually speaks English would have put that dialogue in that order in the way that they did and let that go through. Absolutely not.
Another common criticism of the game were the controls. Similar to those used in Alone in the Dark, tank controls were a necessary evil because of the fixed camera angle. In traditional free-floating third-person camera angle games,
I don't think it would have been near as successful without the tank controls. I think the tank controls made it scarier and made it part of the experience.
The directional controls are relative to the camera. When the camera angle is fixed the way it was in these two games, the orientation of the camera relative to the character had the possibility of switching between rooms. Therefore, left from one camera angle would not be left in another. Does that make sense? Tank controls solved this problem. On the D-pad, up was forward, down was backward, right and left rotated the character clockwise or counterclockwise respectively. The downside of these controls were that it made moving your character in any sort of evasive manner extremely difficult. Perhaps this added to the tension, but for me it was often immersion-busting frustration. Strangely, something that I saw repeated several times across reviews in different major publications.
The remake, or the remaster, whatever you want to call it, is basically a remake. The movement is way jankier than the tank controls, but I think it feels a lot better because you're able to like actually run around and like spin in circles and stuff.
Of the game was praised for the story of the game. Maybe I'm pretty far off base, but the plot is intriguing in that it exists. If you place it directly into a movie, you'd be accused of writing derivative pulp fiction, but without the self-awareness that modern pulp stories bring to the table. That being said, did the plot factor into the game's success? Maybe. Let's talk about that success and the possible reasons for it. First, the rental gambit. Did you know that there was a difference in the...
I don't think the Resident Evil 1 plot actually counted for Resident Evil's success until Resident Evil 2 came out and they added more to it, and then 3 came out, added more, even more to it, and then Resident Evil just had a lore. I think Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 would have been amazing, and then that would have been it if they didn't extend the lore after that with Resident Evil 4 and Code Veronica X and all that. They just they built a machine that worked, and it was great until it wasn't, and it was still kind of great because I love Resident Evil 5 and 6.
The difficulty between the Japanese and US versions of the game? Most of the time that means the game was harder in Japan and easier in the United States, but in this case it was the reverse. In the mid-90s, rental store chains were a big deal in the States, and many of them carried all the latest video games. Capcom of America wanted the game to be more difficult so that it was less likely for the game to be completed on a rental. Now, it would be tough to determine whether this had any impact without some raw data that I have a feeling Blockbuster is in no longer a position to provide. Still, that's one possibility. Let's talk about the marketing. From what I can find, the game had a commercial that aired, but only in the Japanese market. The earliest commercial I was able to find for Resident Evil 1 in the United States market was this Christmas commercial for the director's cut and Resident Evil 2.
This holiday season, be sure to get that special someone the gift they really want. The most intense PlayStation games ever. Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil, the director's cut. Now supports DualShock analog controller.
Obviously, TV time is only one part of the equation. Many gamers in the mid-90s were subscribed to one of
90s video game commercials were just on a different level. They had a vibe to them that just you can't be topped. The modern games, they just all look the same to me. To all of them. There's no character, there's no style. They all have that realistic look. Now they're using that weird like 3D look that's purple that all the woke games are using that I hate. That's in Dragon Age, it's in Avowed, it's in all kinds of games. Dustborn, blah. Concord.
Several gaming magazines, most popular being EGM, GamePro, Game Informer, and the like. My thinking was that surely there had to have been an ad blitz in these magazines, right? Well, yes and no. Prior to the game's release, there were not many paid ads to be found. It was only after March when these spots started appearing. An interesting aside was that there were plenty of ads to be found for another horror game called D, which at the time was soon to be released for the PlayStation. It had been already released a year prior for the doomed 3DO. While there weren't a ton of ads to be found, there were plenty of preview articles, which sometimes felt like advertisements back in the day. These articles were filled with the gory, pun intended, details of the upcoming game, and for an adolescent horror fan such as myself, I ate it up, like a zombie, eating. Never mind. So how about that plot? Well, despite the plot being, by my subjective measure, kind of bad, the fact that it existed and had a tremendous amount of detail was no small feat for the type of game that Resident Evil was. Abundant plot was still something that was more likely to be found in an RPG in the mid-90s. Most games used it simply as an excuse to prop up gameplay. Resident Evil had an attempt at mystery and suspense in the story that unfolds throughout the game, with one decent twist packed in there. Definitely gets an A for effort. And how did this factor into the success? This is probably the most anecdotal piece of this video, so take it with a grain of salt. But I recall in the early days of Resident Evil's release, there was enough plot to spark conversation amongst other kids my age. Rumors about Wesker surviving the Tyrant's attack were born immediately at the lunch table, as well as other elements. The plot, mixed with Easter eggs and hidden items, possibly contributed to a strong word-of-mouth campaign, which was gold to game executives in the 90s. But keep in mind, that is just my conjecture. Finally, let's circle back around to what started me on this discussion: genre. Perhaps the executives at Capcom simply augured the future correctly and identified that finally, the market was actually ready for a horror game, and Mikami's team managed to capitalize by offering gamers something inspired by some of the best horror games of the previous few years and remixing it into something brand new. Now, as I mentioned at the top, the original Resident Evil would be re-released several times over the following years. The director's cut promised to restore the gore to the cutscenes, except it didn't. Capcom blamed it on some sort of localization issue. The director's cut also returned the game to its original difficulty by adding in an auto-aim that was in the original Japanese version and had been stripped away for the American release.
Oh, okay. So I played the director's cut, I think, because I had that. I didn't know that that was a thing. I didn't know that they didn't have that in the original version. Huh.
The director's cut would be released again with DualShock support, and possibly the most controversial change: a completely brand new score by composer Mamoru Samuragochi. Samuragochi, known as Japanese Beethoven because of his deafness, created a new score for the game that was widely panned. Just listen to this one track. Yeah, this made it into the game. The story gets weirder though when it comes out that years later, Samuragochi didn't even write the music that he was credited for. He had been paying a ghostwriter. So not only was it bad, it wasn't even his bad. Such a weird moment in gaming history. The horror genre in gaming did...
I didn't know that it had bad music in it, because when I was a kid, I couldn't really hear the music. There was things going on in the house. I wasn't allowed to just be in a room by myself playing Resident Evil.
Go on to see a boom period after Resident Evil's release. Capcom benefited with continuing the Resident Evil franchise, as well as starting the Dino Crisis series, which was basically Resident Evil with dinosaurs.
Fucking ladybugs everywhere,
Konami
man.
threw their hat into the ring with Silent Hill, and Square Enix had Parasite Eve. Clock Tower, an SNES game which predated Resident Evil, was given new blood, pun intended, as a 3D survival horror. For all the fun and quirks of the first Resident Evil as a relatively early PlayStation game, it ultimately aged rather poorly. It's interesting to look back on the 3D games from the mid-90s and...
I disagree that it aged poorly. I think it did age poorly for a little while, but I think it's come right back around to aging great again because of games like QWOP and getting over it. Like, it's a difficult game that has terrible mechanics that's frustrating, and I love it. I love the first game. I want to go back and play it. I've only recently watched somebody play it. I haven't actually played this game since I was a little kid.
Compare them to the pixel art games of the same time. Frequently, the pixel-based games have aged rather well over the years, and the 3D games, much like the earliest use of CGI in movies, have looked a bit worse for wear. Combined with the shoddy voice acting, Resident Evil was ripe for the remaking when it came time to honor a contract Capcom had signed with Nintendo. But the remake, and what it meant for the franchise, is another story altogether. So that'll do it for this episode. If you like this stuff, take a look at this video on the history of Dark Souls. You can find the channel on Twitter.
Man, I'll get around to that video probably when I pick up Dark Souls again. I got absolutely demolished the last time I played it, but I found out that I was playing it very, very wrong, so I'm going to give her another go at some point. Resident Evil 1. Resident Evil, one of my favorite game series of all time. Resident Evil 1, one of my favorite games of all time, just because of nostalgia. I like to go back and watch people play it. Like Game Grumps, I'll watch Game Grumps play it. I love their Resident Evil series. I'm going to be watching some more Resident Evil content in the coming days before Path of Exile releases. Hopefully I can beat Resident Evil 1 before Path of Exile, because I ain't gonna want to play Resident Evil no more after that game comes out. But I will finish it. I will finish it. But now, I'm sorry, it is time for me to go. But it'll be okay. I'll be back tonight to play Resident Evil 1 for a couple hours. Maybe even a few. And I will be back tomorrow after that. For do this show again. 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. See you there.